$4,000. That number just flashed across every trading screen on Earth. And somewhere, in a room you will never see, a central banker is not celebrating. He is making a phone call, because gold does not rise like this. Without a reason, no one wants to say out loud. The last 3 times this happened, a currency died within 18 months. Nobody on television will tell you which one is next. But by the end of this video, you will know exactly where the money is already moving, and why the people who understand this are no longer waiting. Welcome, friends, to Stick Zennn. If you're joining us for the first time, settle in, because this is not a channel for noise, for hype, or for shouting headlines at you. This is a channel for people who want to understand what is actually happening to their money, quietly, clearly, before everyone else catches on. Now, before we go further, I want to ask you something, the way you might ask an old friend sitting across the table. If this channel has given you even a little clarity, a little peace of mind about the world your savings live in, would you do us the honor of subscribing? It costs you nothing, but it means everything to a small channel trying to tell the truth. And one more thing, I would love to know, where in the world are you watching this from tonight? Type your city, your country, down in the comments, because this community is bigger than you think. Gold crossed $4,000 on a Tuesday morning, and almost nobody outside the trading floors noticed it first. There was no breaking news alert, no red banner scrolling across the television screens, just a quiet number updating on a chart, climbing higher than it had ever climbed before in human history. But in certain rooms with thick doors and no cameras, the reaction was very different. Central bankers in Beijing, in New Delhi, in Ankara, picked up their phones. They were not calling to celebrate. They were calling to confirm. For most people, gold is just jewelry, something worn at weddings, locked away in a drawer, admired but rarely understood. But for the people who run the world's money, gold means something else entirely. It means fear. Not the loud, panicked kind of fear that makes headlines, but a slow, quiet fear that builds for years before anyone admits it out loud. The fear that paper money, the dollars, the euros, the currencies people trust with their entire lives might not hold their value forever. History has seen this pattern before. In the 1970s, gold surged as the world lost faith in the American dollar's promise to be tied to something real. In 2008, it surged again, as banks collapsed and governments printed money to save them. In 2020, it happened once more, as the world shut down and trillions of dollars were created out of thin air. Each time, gold was not the story. Gold was the warning sign, a symptom of something breaking underneath the surface. And each time, the people who understood the warning early protected themselves, while the people who dismissed it did not. Now in this moment, gold has done something it has never done before. It has crossed $4,000. And the strange part is not the number itself. The strange part is who is buying. It is not ordinary investors rushing to buy gold coins. It is central banks, government institutions, the very organizations that print and control currency, quietly buying gold in record amounts. They're not buying gold because they distrust other countries' money. They are buying gold because deep down many of them no longer fully trust their own. Think about that for a moment. The institutions that create money are hedging against the very money they create. This is not something you will hear explained clearly on the evening news. It is buried in reports, in footnotes, in numbers that most people never read. But the pattern is impossible to ignore once you see it. Nation after nation, quietly reducing how much they depend on the dollar, quietly increasing how much gold they hold in their vaults. For the average person, this might feel distant, like something happening far away in rooms they will never enter. But it is not distant at all. Every currency in the world is connected. Through trade, through debt, through decisions made in those very rooms. When central banks lose little faith, it eventually reaches everyone. Through prices, through savings, through the value of a paycheck. So the question is no longer whether something is changing. The number 4,000 already answered that. The real question, the one very few people are asking, is what happens next, and why the people closest to the money are moving faster than anyone else. It unfolded inside vaults. Not the small vaults found in local banks, but massive underground chambers built specifically to hold one thing: physical gold bars, stacked and counted by governments who rarely explain their reasoning to the public. For years, these vaults quietly filled. Reporters barely covered it. Financial channels treated it as a footnote, buried between weather updates and sports scores. But the numbers told a different story than the silence suggested. Central banks around the world had been buying gold at a pace not seen in half a century. Not small amounts, not symbolic purchases. Record-breaking tonnage year after year purchased and shipped and locked away, far from public view. The obvious question is simple. Why would governments, the very institutions that print currency, want to hold something they cannot print? The answer lies in a shift most people have never been taught to notice. For decades, the world ran on an unspoken agreement. Nations held US dollars as their primary reserve, trusting that the American economy and the dollar itself would remain the safest asset on Earth. That trust built the modern financial system. It allowed trade to flow, debts to be settled, and economies to function on a shared foundation. But trust, once questioned, does not rebuild easily. Sanctions became a turning point. When certain nations saw their dollar reserves frozen or restricted due to political conflicts, other countries watched closely. If dollars could be frozen once, they reasoned, they could be frozen again. That single realization changed behavior across dozens of central banks. Quietly, without announcements or press conferences, many began reducing their dependence on the dollar. They didn't do this by rejecting it outright. They did it by diversifying, and gold became the preferred alternative. Gold cannot be frozen by a foreign government. It cannot be erased with a keystroke. It sits in a vault, physical and unreachable, answering to no one but its owner. This is why the buying accelerated, even as the price climbed higher and higher. Normally, rising prices slow down buyers. Higher costs discourage large purchases. But central banks kept buying anyway, treating the price less like a cost and more like insurance. Insurance against a system they no longer fully trust. Insurance against political decisions that could someday freeze their access to dollars. Insurance against a future where currencies lose value faster than expected. The people running these institutions understand something the average saver rarely considers. Currencies are promises, backed by governments, and promises can change. Gold does not rely on anyone's promise. It has held value across empires, wars, and collapsed currencies for thousands of years, long before any modern government existed. This is not a story about panic. It is a story about preparation. While ordinary headlines focused on stock market swings and daily news cycles, a slower and far more significant shift was happening beneath the surface. Nations were repositioning their reserves, protecting themselves against risks most citizens never see discussed openly. And here is what makes this moment different from previous gold rallies in history. This time, the buyers are not driven by short-term fear or a single crisis. They are driven by a long-term recalculation of trust in the global financial system itself. That distinction matters enormously. Short-term fear fades when headlines change. Long-term recalculations do not reverse easily. Once an institution decides to reduce reliance on a currency, that decision tends to deepen over time, not disappear. Which raises an uncomfortable point for anyone still assuming today's financial order is permanent. If the very architects of the global monetary system are quietly hedging against it, the question is no longer whether change is coming. The question is how prepared everyone else will be when it arrives. Governments across the world had spent decades borrowing money they never fully intended to repay in real terms. Instead, the plan, unspoken but consistent, was to grow economies faster than the debt, or in worse cases, to let inflation quietly shrink the value of what was owed. For a long time, this strategy worked well enough to avoid serious consequences. But by the time gold crossed $4,000, the math had changed in a way few politicians wanted to explain to their citizens. The United States alone carried a national debt exceeding $35 trillion. Interest payments on that debt, simply the cost of servicing what was already borrowed, had grown into one of the largest line items in the entire federal budget, competing directly with defense spending and social programs. This was not a temporary imbalance. It was a structural one. Every year, a larger share of tax revenue went not toward roads, schools, or hospitals, but toward paying interest on money borrowed in previous decades. And every year, new debt was added simply to cover the gap between spending and income. Economists have a term for this pattern, a debt spiral, where borrowing is used to pay the interest on previous borrowing. The United States was not alone. Japan, several European nations, and other major economies faced similar pressures, each managing their own version of a debt load that grew faster than their ability to produce and earn. For ordinary citizens, this often felt abstract, something reserved for economists and news anchors. But the consequences were not abstract at all. When governments carry unsustainable debt, they face a limited set of options. They can raise taxes, cut spending, or create more currency to cover the shortfall. Historically, most governments choose the third option because it is the least politically painful in the short term. Creating more currency, however, comes at a cost that arrives quietly, then all at once. Every new unit of currency printed dilutes the value of every unit already in circulation. This process, often described in mild terms like monetary easing, has a simpler explanation. It makes existing money worth slightly less, spread across an entire population who never voted on the decision. This is precisely where gold re-enters the story. Unlike currency, gold cannot be created by government decision. Its supply grows slowly through mining, constrained by geology rather than policy. This scarcity is exactly why it has served as a store of value across centuries, surviving the collapse of currencies, empires, and financial systems that once seemed permanent. As the debt wall grew taller, and as the strategy of creating more currency became less a choice and more a necessity, the connection between rising debt and rising gold prices became difficult to ignore. Investors who studied history recognized the pattern immediately. Sovereign debt crises, throughout different centuries and different countries, tended to resolve in one of two ways: painful austerity, where governments drastically cut spending, or currency devaluation, where the value of money itself was allowed to decline. Very few governments, when given the choice, selected the painful option. This left currency devaluation as the more likely path, a slow erosion of purchasing power that citizens often felt through rising prices without ever connecting it directly to decisions made in distant government offices. Gold's rise, then, was not simply a market trend. It functioned as a signal, a reflection of growing awareness among large financial institutions, that the debt path many nations had chosen carried consequences that would eventually reach everyone. This is the point where the story stops being about central banks or government spreadsheets and starts becoming personal, because the debt wall does not stay behind closed doors forever. It eventually reaches savings accounts, retirement funds, and the daily cost of living for anyone holding a currency built on promises that grow harder to keep with each passing year. History offered a guide, even if the exact timeline remained uncertain. Currency crises and gold surges rarely followed calendars. They followed thresholds, moments when confidence eroded past a point of return, often triggered by an event that seemed minor in isolation, but proved decisive in hindsight. Analysts studying the current environment pointed to several scenarios worth watching closely. In the first scenario, gold's rise continued in a slow, steady climb, reflecting ongoing central bank accumulation and gradual de-dollarization. This path would not create sudden panic. Instead, it would unfold as a quiet repricing of trust, visible mainly to those paying close attention to reserve data and currency flows. Savers who understood this shift early would have time to adjust their strategies calmly, without urgency. In the second scenario, a specific event, a sovereign debt downgrade, a sudden geopolitical shock, or a failed government bond auction, triggered a faster repricing. In this version, gold's climb would not remain gradual. It would accelerate sharply as institutional investors rushed to secure the same protection that central banks had already been quietly building for years. Those late to recognize the pattern would face a market already reflecting the shift, with fewer opportunities to prepare on favorable terms. A third, more severe scenario involved a broader loss of confidence in a major reserve currency itself, not through collapse, but through a visible and undeniable decline in purchasing power. This scenario carried the widest consequences, touching not just investors, but everyday households managing savings, wages, and retirement plans built on the assumption that their currency's value would remain relatively stable over time. Regardless of which scenario unfolded, one detail remained constant across every version. Those who understood the signal early held a structural advantage over those who did not. This advantage had little to do with luck and everything to do with awareness. Businesses that recognized the debt and currency pressures early could adjust pricing strategies, currency exposure, and long-term planning before market conditions forced their hand. Entrepreneurs who understood the shift could make more informed decisions about where to hold reserves, how to structure contracts, and which risks deserved genuine attention versus which ones were simply market noise. Ordinary citizens who grasped the underlying pattern could make more informed choices about savings, diversification, and long-term financial planning without needing to predict the exact date of any single event. This is precisely why gold crossing $4,000 mattered so much, even to people who never intended to buy a single ounce of it. The number itself was not the message. The message was what the number represented: a slow, deliberate shift among the institutions that managed the world's money, moving away from blind faith in currencies and toward tangible, historically proven stores of value. Central banks had already made their decision quietly over several years, without waiting for public consensus or media attention. The debt wall had already been built, one budget cycle at a time, by governments choosing short-term convenience over long-term discipline.